Streedock Beach, on September 21st, 1588, that the galleon carrying Captain Francisco de Cuéllar, the Labia, was wrecked, along with two other ships, the Santa Maria de Vison and the Juliana. According to his own words, the sea rose as if to touch the sky and hurled the three ships against the shore, so violently that within the span of an hour, the three vessels were smashed to pieces, drowning more than 1,000 men, including many nobles, captains, and knights. Captain Francisco de Cuéllar's hope of finding shelter at the small abbey of Stade, very close to Streedock Beach, was short-lived. The monastery had been abandoned by the monks due to the atrocities committed by the English army. The images of the saints had been burned, and 12 Spaniards hung from its ceiling. For the few who knew how to swim at that time, being a sailor did not necessarily mean knowing how to swim, strange as it may seem to us today. Reaching the coast was by no means a guarantee of salvation. On the beach, the savage Irish stripped and robbed the shipwreck survivors, while the English troops occupying Ireland rushed to the coast to finish off any survivors. Despite severe wounds to his legs, Cuéllar managed to reach the shore, hide, and spend the night exposed to the elements. The next morning, he tried to find refuge in a small convent he spotted in the distance. Without food and still wounded, he decided to return to the beach, where he encountered two bloodied and naked men, Alonso and Baltazar, sailors from the Santa Maria de Vison. In tears, they embraced one another. The beach was still covered with corpses. They counted more than 400, and they even buried some of them with their own hands, digging in the sand. Some compassionate Irishmen, who witnessed this harrowing scene, took pity on them and pointed out a route to reach a safe place. Badly wounded, Cuéllar was unable to keep up with his companions, who moved ahead and left him to continue on alone. From a hilltop, he spotted some thatched huts, which he had to reach by crossing the bottom of a wooded valley. As he stood there, 4 men approached him, stealing his gold chain and the relics he carried in a small scapular. Despite mistreating and robbing him, one of them also gave him an ointment to treat his wounded leg and pointed him towards an Irish lord, who, as a friend of his King Philip II, was sheltering the survivors of the shipwrecks. This was the territory of Lord O'Rourke. Although Captain Francisco de Cuéllar referred to the Irish as savages, he always knew that encountering them was far better than falling into the hands of the English. The Irish might rob you, but they usually spared your life and left you at their mercy. However, his misfortunes continued. Along the path he had to follow to seek help, another group of Irishmen assaulted him. They beat him savagely with sticks, stripped him completely naked, and left him freezing cold. After 2 days of limping through the wilderness, sleeping in caves, and covering himself with ferns and straw, he finally caught sight of a lake, Glencar, and next to it, some abandoned houses. One of them, which seemed the most suitable for shelter, finally offered him a small joy, the encounter with 3 other Spanish survivors from a group of 11 shipwrecked men, and a modest meal of fruits and forest berries. The 4 Spaniards then set out together for Lord O'Rourke's territory, but not before receiving help from some Catholic Irish who cared for and treated Cuéllar's wounds. Deeply exhausted and almost unconscious, Cuellar remained in a near comatose state for an entire week, tended by these charitable souls. His companions, fearing an encounter with English troops, moved on ahead. At that time, Brian O'Rourke was sheltering over 70 survivors from the wrecks of the Armada in Ireland. Most of them were wounded and barely clothed. News arrived that the galleon Girona was coming to their rescue, prompting some of the Spaniards to head for the coast. Cuellar, despite his efforts to reach the ship, was too weak to make the journey. The Girona, already badly damaged by the storms, managed to take on some of the unfortunate survivors, only to sink almost immediately afterwards, sending more than 200 sailors to their graves. Lost after being left behind by the last group of Spaniards, hoping to be rescued by the Girona, exhausted and on the brink of suicide, Cuellar encountered an Irish Catholic cleric. Since the priest spoke Latin, a language Cuellar mastered, they were able to communicate. The priest guided him towards lands controlled by Irish lords hostile to the English, and Cuellar set off once more. But bad luck continued to pursue him. He was captured by a couple who deceitfully chained him, intending to turn him into their slave in the blacksmith's forge. He remained enslaved for nearly 2 weeks, until the priest who had previously helped him happened to pass by. Outraged by the blacksmith's actions, the cleric ordered a rescue party sent by McClancy, one of the Irish lords who aided the Spanish fugitives. Among the rescuers was a fellow Spaniard named Salcedo, who had himself been shipwrecked on the Donegal coast. As the blacksmith prepared to crush Cuellar's skull to prevent his escape, Salcedo intervened, slashing the villain's throat while shouting in pure Castilian, "Drop the hammer, you son of a bitch!" McClancy's stronghold stood on an island at the far western end of Loch Melvin. Circular in shape and surrounded by thick stone walls, it was set in an idyllic landscape with a central courtyard, a church, and a bell tower. Salcedo accompanied Cuellar there, introducing him to 8 other Spanish survivors whom McClancy was sheltering. That night they dined on beef, goat, lard, roasted fish, berries, sour milk, oatmeal bread, and a murky and bitter drink flavored with wild herbs. After so much suffering, he surely had earned his Guinness. At last, the captain was recovering, once again using his charm and social skills. A cultured, worldly man, he captivated the local villagers with his stories and tricks, such as reading palms, and especially enchanted the women. Even Eirim, McClancy's own wife, openly flirted with him and ultimately seduced him. Of course, such peace could not last for long. The Viceroy Fitzwilliam had marched north from Dublin with 1,700 soldiers, determined to hunt down the Spanish survivors. Clancy, fearing brutal reprisals for aiding the enemy, relocated his people and livestock to the mountains, inviting the Spanish to follow them. But in a fit of bravado, or foolish courage, Cuéllar and 8 Spaniards chose to stay and defend the castle. They had 7 muskets, 6 arquebuses, a few pistols, some swords, and enough provisions to hold out for 6 months. The English arrived at the castle, executing 2 captured Spaniards to demoralize the defenders. Unable to launch a frontal assault in the muddy terrain, they fired arrows and hurled insults. After 17 days of failed siege, worsening weather forced the English to retreat. News of the English humiliation spread across Ireland. Clancy recovered his castle and even offered Cuéllar the hand of his sister in marriage. But wishing to return to Spain, Cuéllar declined both the marriage and a future in Ireland. He and 4 companions left the protection of Clancy, while others chose to stay and rebuild their lives in the Irish clan. In January 1589, Captain Francisco de Cuéllar and his companions set out for Ulster, from where they could embark to Scotland, as the first step in their longed-for return to Spain. There they learned of the tragedy of the Girona, a ship from the Great Armada which had sunk 3 months earlier. After picking up survivors from 2 other Armada vessels, it carried a crew of 1,300 men. Only 5 survived. The locals showed them the jewels looted from the unfortunate wreck. Cuéllar found refuge in the domain of Lord Achan O'Cahan, in the village of Castle Row, where some women took care of him for a month and a half. Our limping conqueror spoke of the beauty of the young women and the close friendships he maintained with them. But once again, the English refused to abandon their hunt for Spanish survivors. News traveled fast, and the territory was soon crawling with English troops. At the last moment, Francisco de Cuéllar had to leave behind the women's care and set off once more on his flight through the mountains. Thanks to all the nursing he had received, his health had recovered enough for him to cover 30 kilometers a day. He had heard that a Catholic bishop, Redmond O'Gallagher, was offering protection to some of his fellow Invincible Armada survivors near the mouth of the River Foyle, so he set off in search of refuge. There he found 12 other Spaniards, treated with sympathy and generosity, and even receiving daily mass. Cuéllar stayed there for 6 days while preparations were made for a boat that would take them to Scotland on a 2-day voyage. Finally, a boat was ready to begin their journey home. Embarking at McGilligan on a traditional Irish boat, a carrack, built with a wooden frame covered in leather, but at least able to float, Captain Francisco de Cuéllar and 17 companions set off for Scotland. It was early April, 1589, and so ends Cuéllar's adventure in Ireland. The small Irish vessel was diverted from its course by a storm and taken to the Shetland Islands. There they had to spend 2 days repairing the fragile vessel before continuing towards Scotland. Scotland did not offer them the assistance they had hoped for. The Scots were indifferent and unwilling to help. Only a few noble Catholic families offered them any support. Eventually, after managing to contact the Duke of Parma by letter, a Scottish merchant living in Flanders was hired to take them there. It was September 1589, exactly 1 year after the shipwreck on Stridog Beach, when Captain Francisco de Cuellar finally boarded a ship bound for Flanders. On September 22, 1589, the 4 vessels hired by Parma for their return to Flanders were attacked by Dutch enemy ships. 2 were sunk, and the one carrying Cuellar ran aground on coastal sandbanks. Once again, Cuellar saved his life by clinging to a wooden plank to reach the shore. Shipwrecked twice in 1 year. Thanks to the letter from Francisco de Cuellar to King Philip II, we know his story. What is even more extraordinary is to imagine how many of his surviving companions from the Armada in Ireland endured similar odysseys with diverse fates, most of whom, unfortunately, we know nothing about, nor will we probably ever know.